Welcome to the In Her Image podcast, where we seek and celebrate Mother God through scriptures, scholarship, mythology, the arts, and everyday life. This is your host, Jessica Woodbury, and today I am so happy to once again be speaking with my good friend who has been on here before, Maxine Hanks. Maxine, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Jessica. I always love chatting with you, and I really love your podcast.
Well, I love chatting with you and the incredible conversations that we always have. So we have had Maxine, like I said, on before a couple of times. And this year we had talked about doing a 3-part series of conversations. And so I know that I've had some of you reach out to me and talk about how much you have loved those previous conversations and how you have been looking forward to this last one. And we both have had some things going on that kind of put it off a little bit longer than we anticipated or hoped. But we are very excited to finally be able to have this conversation together. So the first episodes that we discussed, if you haven't listened to those, I would encourage you to go back and listen to them. The first one we had was in January, where we talked about how personal revelation was the basis and method for the restoration. And we dive deeply into that and a few other things, but that is kind of the major foundation for that conversation. Part 2 in February, we talked about how revelation then brought theology into this church, and in particular, the theology of Heavenly Mother and how she was present in the origins of the LDS faith, as well as some of the roles of women in that early restoration. So both the divine feminine and the women that contributed to the restoration. So now in part 3, we are going to be diving more deeply into how revelation and theology bring religious ministry, authority, and structure. So how those things impact the structure of the church and our authority within it. So Maxine, I would love for you to kind of just give us a little bit of your own intro of what that looks like and what you would love to dive more deeply into in this conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I liked your review of our part 1 and part 2 because it establishes a foundation of revelation as the foundation of the restoration. And then how revelation brings forth theology, our relationship with God. And so today we'll talk about how our personal connection to the divine brings forth ministry and authority. So, because basically, spiritual power comes from God. It comes from our connection to God. And that's the foundation of religious ministry and structure and authority. And women's spirituality came from their own relationship to God. It's not something that men give to women. So the women in LDS origins brought their own relationship with God and their own spirituality into the church with them. And they developed it there and practiced it there. It wasn't something that Joseph Smith and the men gave to them. And this is important. We haven't talked about this enough. And then also, so women's ministry then and their roles that they played and the authority that came forward actually arose from women's spirituality. Again, it wasn't given to them by men. What Joseph Smith did was validate and authorize and make official, as an official part of the church, women's spiritual gifts and their spiritual practices and their relationship to God and what was coming forth from that. And again, this is important. I delivered a whole paper on this in Kirtland in 2015 about how women's spirituality gave rise to their roles and their authority in the church. And then today also I'll be sharing information from that paper and 2 other papers. I gave a paper at the Church History Conference in Provo at BYU about the early beginnings of the Relief Society is really beginning in Kirtland, not Nauvoo. And then I'll also be sharing information from a paper I gave at Mormon History Association in 2016 about women's ordination, that Mormon women had been ordained since 1830. So I'm sharing some information from those 3 papers today, and I haven't published any of them, but I'm working on getting them ready to publish. So this is kind of advanced preview information from these papers that I will be publishing in the future. But I think it's really important because we haven't talked about this enough. in LDS history and in scholarship that women's ministry and authority arises from their own connection to the divine. And the women were bringing forth their own innovations in LDS origins from the very beginning with Lucy Mack Smith and Emma Hale. I mean, their spirituality, their relationship with God shaped Joseph Smith and helped him and collaborated with him and his visions and revelations to found the church. And so I see Lucy and Emma, along with Joseph and Oliver, as co-founders of the church. I love one of my mentors, Anne Browdy at Harvard, historian of women and religion in America. And her work talks a lot about how women are not marginal. They are central to the founding and creation and establishment and functioning of religious communities. And she is so right. We really see this in LDS origins, and we haven't talked about it enough. So the papers that I've been giving for this last, 8-10 years have been exploring this and trying to bring this forward.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to dive more deeply into this conversation because the way that you frame it is really, really different from the narrative that we most often hear about the restoration, about women, about their power, about their role in the restoration, and even our role now and today. And so I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of questions because I would love to, I want to hear the perspectives and the things that you have uncovered, that you have come to see as you have looked at the history and the theology and all these different things. And also, kind of look at what the major narrative is that we sometimes hear and comparing and contrasting and kind of wrestling with that as well. So I'm excited for you to dive in.
You're absolutely right, Jessica, because what's happened is we've gotten this notion, this idea that all authority comes from a male God and it all comes from men, and they just sort of benevolently put it on women, or share some of it with women, and that's just not what the LDS restoration was founded on. And so I'm going to share a few of those ideas today. It was founded on women's connection to God and men's connection to God working together. And that's the reality of the LDS restoration. And so it's unfortunate that we've over the years developed this idea that women get their authority from men and they get their connection to God from men. But I have to say, I think that's shifting and changing in the last 12 or so years, really ever since Julie Beck, who I really like. I really saw her bringing back the notion of women having their own access to priesthood and the Relief Society as a priesthood body in parallel with the men. And so it is coming back. And so we'll talk more about that today. But what's interesting is that when I've looked at the leading women, the founding women of the LDS restoration, so Lucy Mack Smith and Emma Hale and Mary Whitmer and her daughter Elizabeth Whitmer, these are founding women. Mary Whitmer is, of course, she becomes the mother-in-law of Oliver Cowdery, and Elizabeth Whitmer becomes Oliver Cowdery's wife. And then, of course, we have Lucy as the mother of Joseph and Emma as his wife. These women were very central. And in fact, Lucy, Emma, and Mary are actually three female witnesses of the gold plates in their own way. But they don't serve as the legal witnesses to found and establish the church as a legal entity because men had legal status in 1830 and women did not. They couldn't serve as legal witnesses. They couldn't serve on legal documents and papers. They couldn't own property. So people, again, this is where the mistaken idea has come in that somehow men had all the authority and women didn't. That's not true. In the establishment of the church from 1827 onward to 1830 and on, played an equal and parallel role. But the way that the church was being set up as a legal entity, as a legal organization with the right and authority to preach, and with men who would have elders' licenses and certificates to have the legal authority to preach, it had to be set up with men in the legal roles. And that was because of coverture and the status of women at that time. So on the one side, Joseph was setting up the church and the men's ministerial licenses as legal entities to satisfy the secular requirements of a church. But within the ecclesiastical structure of the church within itself, women were given parallel equal status with the men. And so when I look at the women, these founding women, what's interesting is that Lucy, Emma, Mary, and Elizabeth Whitmer, they all take really vital leading roles in the establishment of the church. And then further on, Bathsheba Smith, Eliza R. Snow, Sarah Granger Kimball, and Zina Huntington Jacobs, those four, they become the first Relief Society presidents after Emma of the church. And these women, they were all women who came into early Mormonism at the founding with incredible spiritual gifts. They were visionaries and mystics, and they brought their own spirituality and connection to God in with them, and they became the leading sisters. And so it's interesting to realize that these women were co-founding the faith. And we see it with Lucy and her influence on Joseph, and which I talked about in an earlier, the part one, I think, and part two is where I talked about that. But Emma is really a co-founder with Joseph because from the beginning in 1827, he receives a revelation that she is the only one and the right one to help him retrieve the gold plates. So she goes to the hill Cumorah with Joseph to retrieve the plates. They retrieve them together and bring them back. And they work together to hide the plates from people who are trying to steal them. And she's a visionary. She's a mystic. She's, every bit the equal of Joseph Smith. They're quite a powerful partnership. And she works with Joseph as the scribe to help him produce the Book of Mormon. And then Oliver comes along, and the three of them work together to bring forth the Book of Mormon. And in that way, the three of them are functioning like the three prophets who led ancient Israel, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. They're kind of a trinity of these prophetic figures, all three working together to bring forth the Book of Mormon. And so in 1830, when the church is organized, those three, Joseph, Oliver, and Emma, become the first three people to have the high church office. They're all ordained to the three highest church offices in 1830. And so I'll delve into that in a minute, but that's just kind of an introductory part. What I want to talk about is how women's spirituality and their parallel equality and authority set up and emerges within the church, within the ecclesiastical church, even though that couldn't be fully expressed outside in secular society. Within the church, women had equality, and it does revive and parallel early Christianity. The same thing happened in early Christianity because in the Jesus movement, Jesus brings women in and treats them as equals with the male disciples. And the women and men become the first witnesses and the apostles of Jesus, the risen Lord. And the women are the first. They're the first witnesses and the first apostles. And so we see in early Christianity that there's this, Jesus on one hand is honoring his own tradition by calling 12 who represent the 12 tribes of Israel as a council of elders for a synagogue, because the synagogues had a council of 12 elders representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And Jesus repeats that. So he's calling 12 elders in his own Jewish tradition.
I didn't know that was like the tradition of the time for establishing synagogues.
Yeah, a synagogue had 12 elders, right. And Jesus had a traveling synagogue. And so he called 12 elders. And this got conflated later in the New Testament, which became very male-centric and tried to write out female authority. It became conflated with the apostles, that he called 12 apostles, but he didn't. He called 12 elders. And it was after he rose from the dead that his disciples then became witnesses and became apostles, because the apostles were the witnesses of the risen Lord. So what he does is he honors his tradition and the male authority of his tradition with 12 elders of the traveling synagogue, and then he brings in women, and he transforms this body, this movement, with men and women as equals, as disciples of the master. And so discipleship is this whole new body of religion. It's a whole new body beyond. It includes the 12 elders, but it goes beyond it. And then those disciples become the apostles, the witnesses of the risen Christ. And what we see in LDS Origins is a beautiful revival and a restoration of that, because what we see is men being called as elders, and then Emma coming in and being called the elect lady. And so I'll dive into that, because what we see of this parallel equality that recreates early Christianity in the LDS Restoration is that there are three stages. The first stage is a New Testament Christian lay ministry that restores this notion of those early elders and ladies and disciples and witnesses. And then in the second stage, so that first stage is from 1830 to 31. And then in the second stage, from 1831 to 36, we see the development and the emergence of ancient Old Testament priesthoods and priesthood orders. And then the third stage is 1842 and 43, when we see the emergence of the high priesthood, the ancient high priesthood, which is the temple priesthood. And so I'm going to talk about those three for a little bit. Did you want to comment?
Yeah. So interesting, even having more of this historical context to early, to Christ's era and the role of women there. And, I've done some reading about that time period, and even just the early, Gnostic churches and the greater role of women during that time period. Or you think about in the New Testament and some of the women who are called as, let's see. I mean, there's what's her name? There's one woman in there who's called like a deacon,
Oh,
right?
yeah, we see
There's
in the early Christian church, and this is during the Pauline period, but we definitely see female offices develop. Women are brought into the offices because at first it's just, elders and the women who are anointers and healers, and then they all become disciples, and then they become witnesses and apostles. So then later, as these early apostles, male and female, go out and start organizing house churches in different cities. In the house churches, what we see are the female bishops and male bishops whoever is the host or the head of a house church, they are the owner, they are the overseer, they are the episcopos, and that's the bishop. So the bishop is just the owner of the house who hosts the house church in their house. And there were women. Lydia, the maker of purple, she's a bishop. And
right.
we see women bishops. And the first one is really Peter's mother. Peter, the disciple who becomes the apostle. The very first kind of house church where the disciples first gather in the New Testament that we see is the house of Peter's mother. So in a way, I kind of like seeing her as the first bishop. But the bishop is just the host of the. And then the servants, the owner's servants who serve the meal, the sacred meal. Well, servant is diakonos, deacon. That's a deacon. A deacon is the person who serves the meal, the sacred meal. And then the presbyter, who becomes the priest, is the one who's reading whatever the sacred words or the letters from the apostles to that particular house church, or the letters of Paul. They read the sacred text and they become the presbyters or priests.
Yeah. And I just love that reframing of the 12 being the 12
Mm-hmm.
elders for this synagogue, and acknowledging that his disciples who later became apostles or witnesses of
Right.
Christ were both male and female. And that, as you mentioned, that, Easter will be coming up this next month, and that the first witnesses, those first called to be apostles or witnesses of Christ and his resurrection were women.
Yeah, it was the women. And he appears to Magdalene first in the garden, in the tomb garden. And then she and two other women are going to and from the tomb and going to talk to the other disciples. And he appears to all three of them on the road. So he appears to the women first, and then the women go to tell the men, and the men don't believe them. And so it's not until he comes and appears to the men that the men finally believe the women. But the women are they're the first witnesses, they're the first apostles. And this later gets revamped in the Gospels, which doesn't write it out. It's still there, it still survives. But the authority shifts over to Peter, James, and John, and they're seen as the top authority. But in reality, it's really Magdalene was the leader of the witnesses and the disciples in many ways. And it's both the women and the men.
Yeah. And they were living in a very sexist time period
Right,
as well
right.
in society where I guess it's not surprising that some of that was presented differently over the ages
Yeah,
and erased in a way. So, well, let's
yeah.
dive in more deeply to the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Joseph Smith and that period beginning around 1830, where the restoration of kind of authority, of ministry, etc., was centered in this concept of more lay Christianity and how that played out and women's roles and participation when it came to that.
Yeah, so in phase one or stage one in 1830, what we see is the establishment and the restoration of early Christianity, the lay Christian New Testament movement, the Jesus movement. So, what we see it very clearly, particularly in 1830, we see it in section 20, which starts to establish offices for men. These are lay Christian offices. They're not ancient Old Testament priesthood offices yet. They are lay Christian offices straight out of the New Testament that we see in section 20 because Joseph is setting up the church as a formal entity. And then in section 24, 25, and 26, I call it a triptych or a trilogy. These three sections establish parallel equal authority for men and women with Joseph, Oliver, and Emma. Section 24 refers to these two elders, and section 20 also calls Joseph as the first elder of the church and Oliver as the second. But what's interesting in section 20, where it's talking about elders, again, it's this lay Christian ministry version. And so, of these elders who are being called, who will have ministerial licenses and the ability to preach, Joseph is simply the first elder, and Oliver is the second elder. But they hold an important office as first and second elder. Nobody is really talking about or really formulating the ancient order of Melchizedek priesthood and offices within that. That doesn't start until 1831 in June. So this is lay Christian New Testament offices. And so what we see in section 24 outlines the duties of the first and second elder, what their role is, what their duties are. Section 25, both of these are in July 1830. Section 25 outlines the duties of the elect lady, Emma, her duties, her role. And what's fascinating is that it's straight out of the New Testament. In 2nd John in the New Testament, it begins with this salutation from the elder to the elect lady. And Joseph is drawing upon that to establish the top three offices of the LDS Church in 1830. The first and second elder in section 24 and the elect lady in section 25. And when you look at section 24 and 25 and compare the duties and roles of the first and second elder, Joseph and Oliver, and then Emma in section 25, they're perfectly parallel. They're almost identical. And all three are ordained, and the word ordained is used.
Okay, so I'm going to cut in for a second here. So you mention in 2nd John how it starts with the elder unto the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth. And do we know who, because I hadn't ever really thought about this being mentioned here before as the elect lady. So I haven't done the research before this podcast episode, but do we know who John is talking to in this chapter and calling an elect lady?
It's such a great question. We don't know exactly. And for a long time, male scholars just assumed that she was a metaphor for the church. But feminist scholars of the New Testament have uncovered more. She's not a metaphor for the church. The elect lady indicates high ranking female authority. So she would be the highest ranking female authority in that area. So she's likely a bishop, or she could be an apostle, a traveling female apostle, either one. Because the metaphor of her children would be the congregants of her house church or her area. So the elect lady is the female bishop or apostle who's overseeing that particular body of believers, and her children are the members of the house church or the body of believers.
So interesting. Okay. So now we can jump back into, you talk about D&C 25 and D&C 24 and the way that those separate the different roles of the elders and elect ladies. So now that I kind of have gotten that, that was just too much of an interesting side note that I'm like, wait, I want to understand a little bit more this reference to the scripture that I hadn't been aware of before.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's jump back into then what you
Yeah.
have seen in those sections.
No, you brought up a really important question, actually, because with Joseph Smith drawing out those two offices from the New Testament, it definitely indicates both the restoration of early Christianity in the LDS origins, but it also indicates that parallel female equality that Jesus had established. And if you look at section 24 and 25, I'll just mention a few of the words that you see in both. In section 25, they're both called and chosen to write something. In section 24, it's to write the Book of Mormon. In section 25, it's to compile a book of hymns. And a book of hymns is a sacred book of scripture, actually. And they're both called to my ministry, and they're both cited as having a calling and an office that they need to magnify their office. And they are both ordained to a specific office. They're both called to expound scriptures and exhort the church. And they're told that they'll be guided by the Comforter, by the Holy Ghost, as to how to fulfill these duties and these offices. And they're both told that the church will support them. And so it's really interesting. It's utterly parallel. I haven't seen that. And if we look back at section 20, I love this quote from section 20. It says, when it's referring to the elders as apostles, it says, called of God and ordained an apostle of Jesus Christ to be the first elder of the church. And it says the same thing about Oliver as the second elder of the church. He's called of God and ordained an apostle of Jesus Christ to be the second elder of the church. And it says, every elder, priest, teacher, or deacon is to be ordained according to the gifts and callings of God unto him, ordained by the power of the Holy Ghost, which is the one who ordains him. So at this point in 1830, they are talking about lay Christian ministry, and they are talking about being ordained by the Spirit. The development of Melchizedek priesthood and offices isn't really happening until 1831. It's a year and a half later. So it's important to think about that these offices are utterly parallel, and these are New Testament offices. And we haven't understood that because we tend to project the later development of priesthood and Relief Society. We tend to project that back onto 1830 without realizing what was really happening in 1830.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about this concept of ordination because it seems also very different from the way that we talk about it now, in that you talk about being ordained by the Spirit and that there's no evidence at this time of them performing hands-on ordinations for any of them.
Well, no,
right?
Actually they are. And this is, again, what's interesting and why it gets confusing. They are laying on hands to ordain. And that's in section 25. It says, thou shalt be ordained, for he will lay hands upon you, and by the power of that. But again, what's interesting is the formula for ordination comes from Alma. And it's also repeated in the early sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, before we get to section 24 and 25. The formula for ordination is A, you're called by the Spirit to a calling that you feel. B, someone lays hands upon you to officiate or to validate this calling, and they give you a blessing that formalizes this call. That's the formula in Alma and in the Doctrine and Covenants. That's the formula that's being used at this point. So there's a call to the Christian ministry, and then hands are laid upon their heads, and they are ordained to an office. But Joseph, Oliver, and Emma all are called and all are ordained to an office. So what are they ordained to? They're not being ordained to Melchizedek priesthood at this point. This is before that. They are being ordained to the Christian office of elder, first and second elder, and elect lady. And this is an office in the lay Christian ministry, the order of disciples and apostles. And I love the way section 20 is saying an elder is an apostle. Well, that's straight out of the New Testament. because the elders and the women who become the witnesses become the apostles. And so, it's just a lay Christian ordination and office to establish this restoration of early Christianity.
So interesting. And is there evidence that those that were doing the ordination of laying on of hands had to seem to hold some kind of official priesthood in order to do that?
That's a great question. And that is where that's such a good question because it's complex. But we see Joseph being the one who's ordaining people, and then Oliver, and they, back in 1829, when they received this ordination from John the Baptist, who was part of the John and Jesus movement, right, of early Christianity, he ordains them to their offices, and they ordain each other, and so it's Joseph and Oliver who are ordaining these other elders, priests, and deacons in 1830 in section 20.
And elect ladies.
Exactly. Joseph ordains Emma as the elect lady. And I'll talk about when that happens in a minute. But again, we've projected Melchizedek priesthood authority backward in a way that it hasn't really fully developed. But what I want to say about that is that those offices, and this is what happens in early Christianity as well. It really mirrors early Christianity. Those first early offices that emerged, those lay Christian ministry offices, they have a dual role, because at first they're offices from the Jesus movement, from John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John, who also ordain Oliver and Joseph to their offices of elder. Those offices later become offices in the Melchizedek order, the Melchizedek priesthood. So they're double duty. They're at first offices from that early Christian movement and church, and then they become offices in this order of Melchizedek priesthood. The same thing happens with the elect lady. The elect lady is this lay Christian church office in 1830, but in 1842, she's the leader, the elect lady of the Relief Society, which is a female order of priesthood. And I'll get to that in a minute. So there are hints of Melchizedek priesthood early on in 9 and 30, because the offices that Joseph and Oliver are ordained to later become offices within the formal quorums of the Melchizedek priesthood. And the same with the elect lady. It becomes a formal office. She's the head of the presidency of the Relief Society. But in this early phase in 1829 and 30, at that point, they're just restoring the early Christian movement. And a few key offices that were established in the early church with Jesus and John, and then later with Paul, who's Paul the apostle is fleshing out those offices more.
Okay. So
yeah, let's get back to what's happening in section 24, 25, and 26. Should we do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
So I know I get off on tangents, but
well, and partly I have so many questions because you're like sharing so much information, and I'm like, wait a minute, let me make sure that I am catching that and understanding it.
Well, you're
fully,
unpacking
right?
it beautifully, and your questions key in to really important tensions that we haven't understood, and that later we've projected backward onto that early origins of the church, a different understanding and interpretation, because we haven't fully understood how it emerges, in its own time and context. So, and so what we have with section 24, 25, and 26 is this triptych. Like I said, they're all in July. They work together as a triptych. The three of them relate to each other. 24, 25, and 26 are seen originally as part A, B, and C. And so section 26 is common consent, where all things in the church are to be done by common consent, which means women get the vote within the church. They don't have the vote in secular society, but within the church, they do. And again, this parallels early Christianity, because within the house churches, women had equality, but outside in the larger society, they didn't. And that's when women start to lose their authority in early Christianity as the little house churches become more public. The public secular society does not recognize women's equality that they had in the Jesus movement as disciples and apostles, and that they had in the early house churches with Paul and other apostles. They had equality within the house churches and the private communities. It was private space. And this is what feminist New Testament scholars, particularly Karen Torgeson in her book, called When Women Were Priests. This is what they've discovered. Women had that equality in the house, within the private house churches, private society, but not out in secular society. And that's how they start to lose it. Well, this is parallel in early LDS origins. Within the church itself, women had parallel equality with the men, but outside in the secular society, they didn't. So women and men are voting in the LDS church. They kind of really start in around 1832 and, in that time. But women are voting and they're using election and nomination of officers, and they're electing their own officers in the Relief Society in 1842. Well, this is 18 years and also 6 years before the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in New York, pretty nearby, not far from Palmyra, starts to organize women to get the vote in America. So you see this pattern of women getting the vote within the church in private religious society when they don't have it in the secular society. And so what happens is that in section 25, Emma Smith is ordained the elect lady in parallel with Joseph and Oliver as the first and second elders. And in section 26, women get the vote. Emma, as the elect lady, people don't realize this either, and this comes from my work. She's formally ordained to a high church office because Joseph, Oliver, and Emma are the three highest leaders in the early church in 1830. They are a primitive first presidency. Before the first presidency of the male, high priesthood is formulated later in 1831, and before the Relief Society presidency is formulated in 1842. It begins here in this primitive proto-presidency. They're the only general authorities. It's Joseph, Oliver, and Emma in 1830. And so they're like a lay Christian presidency, like you would see with the three women who become apostles in early Christianity, or Peter, James, and John, in Jerusalem. You see this presidency of three, and you see it in Joseph, Oliver, and Emma in 1830 in section 24 and 25. It's really important because Emma is the first woman in America, as far as we know, who is formally ordained to highest church office over a congregation, which is accepted and approved by the congregation. She's the first in U.S. history, because other women, we start with Anne Hutchinson, way back in the 1600s, and other women who are called to ministry, and they feel a call to minister or preach or teach scripture, or, we have just a very few women who are called to ministry, but no one before Emma Smith is formally ordained as, to the highest church office in an existing church, along with the men, and as recognized by the church. So it's pretty significant.
Yeah, that is really a different and unique way of looking at it from what I feel like, have traditionally think about, And I think it's really interesting to, as you said, group those three revelations together that happened in this proximity of time, and to see because are these the only three official positions really laid out at all at this point in the church? Is the first elder, the second elder, and the elect lady?
Well, they're the three highest. In section 20, we see that these early Christian offices are starting to be called and ordained of elders and teachers, and deacons. And so we're seeing those offices being called again out of the New Testament. But the three highest, these three, section 20, 24 and 25 established Joseph, Oliver, and Emma as the highest leaders. And this is like really the second phase, because in the first phase, they're operating as three prophets working together, bringing forth the Book of Mormon, like Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And I see very strong parallels there, because in the Doctrine and Covenants, we see Joseph and Oliver continually compared to Moses and Aaron. And this comes up in section 28 again, and I'll mention that in a minute. We see Joseph and Oliver equated as restoring those roles or recreating the roles of Moses and Aaron. And Emma is not specifically mentioned as creating the role of Miriam, but she does. Because Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were the three prophets who led Israel together. All three were prophets. And Joseph, Oliver, and Emma worked together to bring forth the Book of Mormon. And then in section 25, Emma is called to lead the women and to lead music in the church. Well, that's exactly what Miriam, the prophet, does. in the Old Testament, she leads all the women, and she is the one who leads the women and the children of Israel in song. And she chooses the music and the song and leads them. So Emma is also a Miriam figure in section 25 again. But that's sort of the prophetic role, which you also see in early Christianity. You see men and women as prophets. You see Anna the prophetess in the temple in the New Testament, So you see men and women as prophets in early Christianity, particularly in the Jewish Jesus, John and Jesus movement phase. But then you also see Jesus calling them as disciples and then witnesses, apostles. So that develops into that early Christian church phase. And that's what we see recreated in LDS Origins. We see Joseph, Oliver, and Emma functioning as like prophets did even in the New Testament, Old and New Testament, like Anna the prophetess in the temple. And then we see this early Christian these offices develop in sections 24 and 25, like you see in the early Christian church with the establishment of witnesses and disciples and apostles. And so section 27, I want to mention section 27 and 28 really quick, because section 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28 all work together. You have the triptych in July of 24, 25, and 26, or part A, B, and C, and then in August, you have section 27, and that's when Emma's ordained and confirmed. That's her first communion, her first sacrament meeting as a member. That's when and where Joseph confirms her, as predicted in section 25. He will lay hands upon her and confirm her, and he will ordain her. So she is confirmed and ordained in August and section 27 doesn't explicitly talk about that, but it talks about how Joseph is going out to find wine for this sacrament meeting that he's going to have with Emma and a couple of other people who are there, who are also going to be confirmed, and another woman. And so he goes to get wine, and an angel appears to him and tells him, you don't have to use wine, and don't purchase wine of your enemies. You should only use wine that you've made yourself. And the angel tells him, it doesn't matter what you use. It doesn't matter what food or drink you use for the sacrament, as long as the focus is on Christ and our relationship to Christ and Christ, his sacrifice and his redeeming role in our lives. So it's a really powerful section. But the reason it relates to section 25 is section 27 is talking about the sacrament meeting that will fulfill the promises in section 25. Because it's at that sacrament meeting where Joseph is going to get wine, as he's instructed that it's okay, you can use water, you don't need wine. So they probably used water for that one. And so he has this sacrament meeting where he blesses the communion, and it's Emma's first communion. It's her first sacrament meeting where she's confirmed, and that's when she's ordained. And we don't talk about that enough. You have to read between the lines to realize that that's when and where section 25 is fulfilled, and it actually happened.
Okay. And I have one more question kind of about this, the first and second elder and the elect lady. And at the time, because I feel like now we read that scripture, we read D&C 25, and people don't see it as an office at all. It's just like, oh, he's giving her a nice name, and he's complimenting her for just being such a wonderful, powerful, faithful woman, right? Do we know if the people of the time in that super early church saw that as a title and not just a title with authority of some kind, and not just a complimentary title,
You ask such great questions. That's so perfect, because yes, we have come to redefine section 25 as something different than it was. We keep hearing people talk about it as that she was set apart. She really wasn't ordained to anything. Well, that's because she was not ordained to Melchizedek priesthood. So people think all priesthood is Melchizedek, and therefore she wasn't ordained to priesthood. Well, nobody was being ordained to Melchizedek priesthood at that point, other than if you want to look at Joseph and Oliver's offices as doubling later as both Melchizedek priesthood offices, but earlier as New Testament Christian offices. But she wasn't ordained to Melchizedek priesthood. She was ordained to the lay Christian ministry in the office of elect lady. But she was ordained in the very same way and sense that Joseph and Oliver were. So it's a misreading to say she wasn't ordained. She was.
Yeah. And so that, was
Yeah.
seen as like an office, and not just like a complimentary
No, it
title,
wasn't a
phrase,
complimentary
like a
title.
term of endearment.
No, it wasn't just an empty title. This was an office, highest office of the church. That's why she's called to compile the hymnal and other things. She's leading in so many ways. She's called to preach and exhort the church. She's told
Yeah,
she'll be supported by
true.
the church. So, yeah, and there's
Yeah.
lots of evidence actually that her office is recognized as an office because in 1842, when the Relief Society is formalized, Joseph explicitly says then that she doesn't have to be reordained to the elect lady to lead the Relief Society because she was already ordained at the time the revelation was given in 1830. And that's really important. Also,
So
yeah.
interesting.
Also, the other thing I want to mention is that the women are aware of this. The women take this seriously. This goes back to women's spirituality and women's spiritual practices in Kirtland. The women in Kirtland are very aware that they are restoring the ancient order of female disciples from the early Christian movement. They are aware, they are alive to this, they talk about it. They see themselves as restoring this ancient order of women disciples and apostles. And actually, I'll get to that in just a second because I'm going to talk about that as phase two. We'll wrap up phase
Okay.
one here. Phase two in 1831 to 1836, when they're going to build the Kirtland Temple. And then also 1842 to 44, when they're building the Nauvoo Temple. This phase two is when the women's order, the Society of Sisters, the Relief Society, emerges. First in Kirtland and then in Nauvoo. And I'll explain that in a minute. I just wanted to say one more thing about 1830. 20A, this is just a last thought. Section 20A talks explicitly about Joseph as Moses and Oliver as Aaron. And it's referring to Joseph's authority as a prophet, that he has an authority that is above the other leaders. And this is a really important section because during this lay Christian ministry time period, this stage, everybody's alive with the gifts of the Spirit, the power of revelation and the gifts of the Spirit and using seer stones. And it's a very lay Christian, charismatic, dynamic, early church at that time. And so what we see is that there are others who are receiving revelations and using seer stones. And it becomes kind of an issue because what happens is that Hiram Page, who is actually, he's part of the Whitmer family. He marries one of the Whitmer daughters. He gets a revelation and a seer stone. And Oliver really thinks that he's receiving true revelations. Oliver respects his revelations. Oliver is basically going to be his brother-in-law when Oliver marries the other Whitmer sister. But Joseph receives a revelation in section 28 that invokes Moses and Aaron, and it doesn't mention Miriam by name. But what it's doing, that section 28 is really referring to what happens in the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, where in Numbers 12, God calls Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of the meeting, which is the tabernacle. He calls them all, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you can read in Numbers 12, he's basically saying you're all prophets, but Moses has a different role. He is a prophet. Well, basically the Lord says, when there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions, meaning that he talks to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, all of them in visions. But he says, this is not true of my servant Moses. When I speak with him, I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. So God is differentiating Moses's role as a prophet from Aaron and Miriam's roles as prophets. So in section 28, it's really invoking that story because section 28 says, and speaking about Joseph and how he has a different role as a prophet than the other early members and leaders who are receiving revelations and visions. Section 28 says, no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church excepting my servant Joseph Smith, for he receiveth them even as Moses. And so it's reflecting back and kind of evoking that incident with Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So I just wanted to mention it really quickly because this is one of the many ways that I see Joseph, Oliver, and Emma as kind of recreating the Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, three prophets who lead Israel, because this particular section, I think, is really invoking that story. And Miriam is very present in that story.
Yeah, and I love how you said how really when you know that story of Miriam and Moses and Aaron, you can see the similarities. You can see the roles and the ways in which Emma and what she was called to do is similar to what Miriam did in that Old Testament, in the records that we have, and her role there, and that she was called a prophet, right? But then it talks about her leading them in song and in dance. And so it's just really interesting to see those parallels that I would guess most of us probably haven't recognized before.
I realized this one day, I've been working on all this research on women's authority and priesthood since the 1980s, but this notion of Emma restoring the Miriam role came to me when I was teaching young women's. I was in the young women's presidency back in 2013, and I'm teaching the lesson about Miriam the prophet, and that's when it hit me. And I realized, oh my gosh, section 28 is evoking Numbers 12, and Emma is reviving the Miriam role. And so she's reviving both in section 25, and then also her work on the Book of Mormon. She's reviving the Miriam role, but she's also reviving that early Mary Magdalene role as the elect lady or leader of the female disciples. Because what we will see here in phase 2 of women's ministry and authority in LDS origins is the women themselves restoring the ancient order of female disciples in Kirtland and in Nauvoo. And so the elect lady is also evoking that notion of the highest ranking female leader and also the female witness, the female apostle, which is a Magdalene, image. And so I really see Emma as reviving both the Miriam role from the Old Testament and the Magdalene role from the New Testament, female disciples and witnesses and apostles of Jesus Christ. And so what happens in this early movement of women in Kirtland is that they really see themselves as restoring the early Christian female disciples. And there are a number of sources and quotes I could go into that are in my papers, but there are quite a number of references. One of my favorite references comes from the book, The Women of Mormondom by Edward Tulledge. And it's so interesting because he says, and the Women of Mormondom is one of our best sources on Kirtland, because Eliza R. Snow is co-authoring. She's the silent co-author of that book with Coleridge. It's not published until 1876 or 77. I think it's 77. I never remember I think it's early 77. It's the same year Brigham dies. But they published this book that goes back and recovers the history of women in Kirtland and in the early church origins. And because Eliza is the silent co-author, she's bringing back a lot of information that had been forgotten that she was aware of because she was there. She joined the church very early on in Kirtland. And Eliza was a very mystic, spiritual, visionary woman. But anyway, in the book, Women of Mormondom, it says that the disciples and apostles are both men and women. And it says, we can only understand the Mormon sisterhood by viewing them as apostles who have heard the voices of the invisibles, commanding them to build the temples, apostolic mediums of a new revelation, prophetic women who undertook to found their half of a new Christian empire. Okay, right there, that confirms everything I've been saying, that they're seeing themselves as disciples and apostles, and they're co-founding the restoration of Christianity.
Yeah. And that last line as well, emphasizing them taking on the building of their own, female kind of half of this kingdom and restoration.
Well, there's so much. I mean, I could write a whole article about this one passage in Women of Mormondom because it's talking about how we have to view them as apostles who have heard the voices of the invisibles, that's the spirit, and also the early Christian disciples who are kind of working through them, commanding them to build temples. And they are apostolic mediums of new revelation and prophetic women. So it's bringing together that office of the prophet, that women are prophets and they're also apostles and they're disciples, and that they're building the temple, and that this comes forth during the building of the temple. And this is what I see when I presented my paper. It's called Revisiting Relief Society Origins. I presented that in 2015, I think 2016, at the Church History Symposium at BYU. But I talked about how the Relief Society actually begins in Kirtland, not in Nauvoo. It begins as a society of sisters who are working through their spiritual gifts and practices that are coming through them from the Holy Ghost. And they are working to restore this ancient order of female disciples and an ancient order, female women's order of the temple. Because in 1833 to 36, they're working to build the Kirtland Temple, and the sisters are creating the clothing for the workers and the men, and they're creating the textiles and the veils and all of the fabrics that will be used in the temple to decorate the interior of the temple. Some women were actually working on construction too, actually, but it's the women are, as they're working on the temple in Kirtland, they're doing exactly what they do later in Nauvoo. They're creating the tapestries, the veils, the clothing, the fabrics, and they're organizing intuitively and spiritually as a women's order of the temple and as an order of female disciples. And so this early sisters society working on the Kirtland Temple is really the proto-relief society. It's where the relief society begins, but it doesn't get formalized until 1842 in Nauvoo. And so I reframe the history because I'm always very adamant about Joseph did not organize the Relief Society. Every time I hear that, I just cringe. He did not organize the Relief Society. He respected and understood female spirituality, women's visions, women's gifts, women's authority, women's equality. He let the women bring it forth on their own in Kirtland and Nauvoo. And the women bring it forth. They are the ones who restore the ancient order of female disciples. And they are the ones who bring it forth. What Joseph Smith does, and this is amazing, and this is one of the many reasons I love him, he recognizes it. He allows it. He doesn't presume to dictate or tell women what to do. He allows them to bring it forth themselves, and then he formally recognizes it and validates it as an equal parallel order and part of the ministry, and then later the priesthood. And so these women are basically restoring this. And we see this in the women of Mormondom, that this is talked about. And so people tend to discount the Relief Society and its authority as some sort of auxiliary to male priesthood, or some sort of just ladies society that has no priesthood. And what they've missed is the ecclesiastical equality. It's a real mistake. Priesthood doesn't only come in the temple, and it doesn't only come through the Melchizedek order. The truth is that the sister society is an order, a female order of priesthood. And where we see that explicitly said is in the Relief Society minutes in 1842 and 43 and 44. And what happens is, after they leave Kirtland and go to Nauvoo, the sisters recreate what they did in Kirtland. And Sarah Granger Kimball is there, and she kind of takes the initiative to really organize it. She's the one who organizes it along with Eliza. Well, she was there in Kirtland, and so was Eliza, and so was Emma. They're just recreating what they did in Kirtland, but they're wanting to formally organize it again on their own, so they write a constitution because they want it to be a legal entity, just like the other legal entities in the church. But Joseph comes along and says, oh, wait a second, this is even better than a constitution. This is better than a secular society. This is an order, a body, a priesthood. And he says, just wait till you meet together and I'll explain, what I mean. And so at the Relief Society first meetings in 1842, Joseph then formalizes as an official ecclesiastical body of the church this sisters society that has restored the ancient order of female disciples and apostles and witnesses. He's formalizing it as an official priesthood body of the church. And that's what happens in Nauvoo. And in the minutes, he clearly stipulates, and the evidence is all over the place in the Relief Society minutes. He says, I will make of this society a kingdom of priests, as in Enoch's day, as in Paul's day. And he says this society should move according to the ancient priesthood. And there are all these references. And the Relief Society presidency is ordained to preside over the church even as the first presidency of the male priesthood presides over the church. And it's really powerful. We have misread those comments because the Relief Society is formally organized as having restored an ancient female body of priesthood. And we have references from Eliza R. Snow in 1842 saying that the Relief Society is an order. And we have references from her saying that we learned from our beloved prophet that the sisters, this Relief Society, that the same organization had existed anciently in the early Christian church. And there are so many references. They're all in my paper. But it's important to realize that this is when the women are organized as a body or order of priesthood. And again, the word ordain is used. The Relief Society officers, presidency, are ordained. They're not ordained to Melchizedek priesthood. They're ordained to the sister society, the ancient female society or order, as the leaders, the presidency of that order. And so it's been confusing. People think, well, women weren't ordained. And even John Taylor says when he ordains Eliza in 1880, he's saying, well, they're not ordained to priesthood. I was there in 1842, and it's not priesthood. It's not Melchizedek priesthood, but it is priesthood. It's female priesthood. It's the female order. And so there's this confusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's like that confusion is still is what is being taught officially, right? Even on the church website today. And so I know I had mentioned to you before that how even, I think it was just this week, that something new published on the church's website called Women's Service and Leadership in the Church. And it has a number of different headings, including one that says, I've heard that Relief Society presidents were once ordained. Is that true? And the way they describe it is, members in the 19th century did not understand this terminology to mean that sisters had been ordained to priesthood office or had the priesthood conferred upon them. And then it goes on and later says, in later years, the term ordained was more precisely defined to refer only to a priesthood office. And so even when you talked about the Relief Society and how we see it as auxiliary now, it is auxiliary now.
Yeah, and it wasn't. It
is kind of subsumed under, but yeah, there's this understanding. I've even had conversations with a male leader before where I kind of brought up how the Relief Society has over a period of time lost so much of its own autonomy and all these different things. And he just said, that's not true.
Yeah.
So many of our members, including our leaders, don't know the history, the basic history that can even be agreed upon, much less, these other ways of looking at it and of asking more questions and saying, look at, those initial minutes from that meeting. In part, I think why we have interpreted them to not for it to not be a priesthood organization is because those minutes were altered before they were published to the church, even in Brigham Young's time, I believe it was. I remember reading about that in the history as well, and how when they were publishing those minutes, I believe it was still during Brigham Young's lifetime in Utah, that they very specifically edited those parts where it says, that it is a kingdom of priest, is like, make it to you a kingdom of priests as in, other days, but also even where he says that I turn the key to you, and these things that were edited in order that really change it, that really change the message that is being given.
Right. No, you're exactly right. There is a lot of confusion. In fact, after Joseph Smith dies, things change rapidly. And then after they all get out to Utah, things get redefined. The women are holding on to it. Eliza R. Snow, Bathsheba Smith, Zina, Jacobs Young, and Melissa Granger Kimball. They're holding on to it. They're holding on to the original understanding and the parallel authority, and they're trying to finish fleshing that out. Eliza and Melissa are organizing quorums of young women as deacons and teachers and priests. They're deacons and teachers because they hadn't gotten to the point of ordaining the women as young priests or priestesses, but they were trying to finish fleshing out those offices, because in the Relief Society minutes in 1842, Joseph Smith very clearly tells the Relief Society presidency a couple of things. He says, I now turn the key to you. and revelation and knowledge will flow down from this time forward. And he meant right then. He didn't mean a year and a half from now when you get the temple endowment. He meant right now, from this time forward. The Relief Society president had her own key of revelation that goes with that office of the elect lady. And he also said that, that presidency would preside. And then there's a very important comma that Eliza placed there. They will preside over the society just as the presidency, meaning the first presidency, preside over the church. And where Eliza placed that comma clearly indicates that they will preside in parallel over the church, just as the first presidency. So the Relief Society presidency was the parallel to the first presidency. They were not under the first presidency, and they were not under the apostles. The apostles don't ascend to that level of authority until after Brigham Young becomes the leader, and he brings the apostles into a higher position. And that's a whole other paper that I won't get into. But basically, we haven't understood that the Relief Society is a body, an order of priesthood, an order of women. And yet it's there. It's in the Relief Society minutes. It's pretty explicit. But we've redefined it. And so there's a misunderstanding, but I just want to say it is coming back. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah. So in that time, when they talk about it being an order of the priesthood, which, those words are there, right? Then were women who were a part of it, did they have to be ordained into this priesthood order in the way that men were being ordained into a priesthood order? And if there is that difference, then I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, that's such a good question. You ask all the best questions, Jessica. Again, Joseph explicitly says in the Relief Society minutes that it's up to the Relief Society presidency to decide what they want to call themselves, how they want to organize their offices, and what they want to call their offices. And he says, it's up to you. I'm paraphrasing, but he says it's up to the Relief Society presidency, the officers, to decide, how they want to organize their quorums and their offices and what they want to call them. And he says, whether you want to call yourselves deacons and teachers and priests like we do, or whether you want to choose other titles. He leaves it to them to devise their own priesthood offices and their own quorums. And so the women are really trying to do that in Utah in the 1850s and 60s. We've got references in the Relief Society minutes in those wards to Eliza and Sarah Granger Kimball trying to organize the women in quorums with those offices, quorums of deacons and teachers, etc. And they organize a board of leadership of the women leaders over the Relief Society. But the bishops are pushing back because the bishops have lost that sense by then. They're pushing back. And so that kind of fades away. And then later we get the offices of Beehive and then Gleaners and Laurels and Maya Maids, and those kind of become the offices. But in lieu of these other offices, but that still hasn't been fleshed out. It still hasn't been finished. It's an unfinished work that is stipulated in the Relief Society minutes. But what I love, and I'm going to read a quote that'll blow your mind from the Relief Society meeting a week ago. But what I love is the way this is all coming back. It's coming back. It's just confused. I mean, you've got teams, so many different teams up in Church Historical Department and Public Affairs and things who prepare documents for online, and they have to be really careful. They're doing ongoing work and recovering more and more of our history. But when they put something out as a general document, they have to be really careful and have to kind of speak in more general terms, because the public documents being released on church websites are not where the research is. They're kind of out there, and there's way more research happening and more happening. But the documents that we see from time to time are kind of preliminary, and the whole thing is evolving. Like President Nelson said, we're in the midst of the restoration. It's not done. It's happening. It's ongoing. I wanted to mention again, Julie Beck. This is one of the things that brought me back to the church when I saw that the Relief Society minutes were finally going to be prepared and put online as part of the Joseph Smith papers. That was huge, because you were right. Things did change. Things were redefined, particularly in Utah, when the Relief Society's authority was redefined and the minutes were always hidden. Even though Eliza guarded and protected those minutes with her life and carried them with her to Utah, because that was the law and constitution of the female order. It was like a female doctrine and covenants. The Relief Society minutes are the official canon of the female priesthood, the female order. So Eliza protected those with her life and carried them out here and protected and saved them so that we have the original minutes, which are amazing. And yet we don't see them. They don't come online until, oh my gosh, when I'm trying to remember the year, if it's 2011 or 2000, I can't remember. I'll have to look at, but it's right before I came back to the church. Those minutes finally go online. And then Julie Beck, the Relief Society president, who I had so much respect for, she was the first one who I was hearing her talk about the Relief Society as part of the priesthood and having access to priesthood powers. And she was describing it as a form of priesthood. And she didn't claim that it was Melchizedek priesthood. She said, the Relief Society is part of the priesthood. She was describing it as a quorum or a body of the priesthood. And what's interesting with Eliza Snow, who she becomes the Relief Society president in Utah, she stipulates in the Women's Exponent in 1884, I think it is, that the Relief Society was designed to be a self-governing organization in parallel with the male priesthood, and that the women were supposed to go to the Relief Society leaders for any issues, not to the bishops. They were not to go to the bishops. They were to go to the Relief Society president, and then she would go to the Stake Relief Society president if she needed further information or direction, and then the Stake Relief Society presidents were to go to the Relief Society general president and board if they needed further direction. And then she said after that, the only recourse is basically for the Relief Society presidency to then talk to the first presidency. So, it was just very different. But I want to read what Camille Johnson said in this meeting, because it's a mind blower. Let's see if I can find my quote here. When the Relief Society had its general meeting, when was it? A week and a half ago? And the Relief Society presidency met in the Red Brick store, and it was just the three of them sitting there on chairs by themselves in the Red Brick store where the Relief Society was organized in 1842. And I loved it because it evoked and recreated this notion of Emma and her two counselors in 1842 being ordained in that room. Emma was already ordained, but her ordination was reiterated and formalized at that time. And they were ordained in that room to lead the female society. Anyway, here's what President Johnson said in the midst of her comments. She said, Joseph Smith restored all things, including the ancient order of women, collectively bringing the relief of Jesus Christ to others, our objective from the beginning. And I just went, wow, that blew me away. And that's President Camille Johnson. And so I'm seeing this coming back, Jessica. I can't remember which leader it was who said in the Relief Society minutes in 1844, and Joseph also said this, it takes all to restore the priesthood. And that's what I'm seeing. It takes leaders, historians, feminists. It takes all of us working together to piece this back together and restore the priesthood and the fullness of the priesthood.
Wow. So interesting to dive deeply into that history that we have and to catch a glimpse of the things that are still there, the things that have changed, and again, the potential that is there and that hopefully, is we can each just be doing our part to acknowledge and you talk about it, restoration being a communal effort.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right. So on that note, let's dive into the third phase that you mentioned at the beginning. This phase from 1843 to 44, when it comes to the temple, the holy order of high priests and priestesses, and all that is taking place at that time.
Yeah, and I won't go into this too much. It's from my papers and another whole paper that I've got. But basically, phase one was the lay Christian ministry, 1830. Phase two was the restoration of the ancient priesthoods, when Melchizedek priesthood as an order and as quorums and as offices within those are being fleshed out from 1831 to 36 in preparation for the Kirtland Temple. And the Society of Sisters, this ancient order of female disciples, emerges in Kirtland in preparation to build the temple. And so phase two is this restoration of ancient gendered priesthoods, male and female. And so the Sister Society is the parallel of Melchizedek priesthood, because the Melchizedek priesthood and Aaronic priesthood are to prepare men for the temple and for the high priesthood of the temple and the temple endowment. And it's the same with the Sisters Society and the Relief Society and the Young Ladies Relief Society, which forms in 1843, which is an auxiliary of the Relief Society. It's actually the Young Gentlemen's and Young Ladies Relief Society of Nauvoo, but it's both of them together, but they're an auxiliary of the Relief Society. Anyway, so the second phase or stage of women's authority and priesthood and ministry in the church is this the ancient male and female orders that are restored in preparation for the temple. And that's what those are. They prepare men and women for the temple. So there's this misunderstanding that I often hear where people say, well, men have to be ordained to get the temple endowment, but women don't have to be. Well, no, that's not true. The women were ordained also in parallel to the men, but we have forgotten that because the Relief Society had to be organized formally, and that order and its offices had to be set up to prepare women for the temple, just like the Melchizedek and Aaronic priesthoods had been organized. So the women were ordained, but they didn't get a chance to finish fleshing out their offices and the titles of their offices because of all the conflict and chaos erupting in Nauvoo and the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram, and then the move to Utah. So the women didn't get to finish defining and naming their offices and forums. So the women did have to have that preparatory ancient priesthood as well to prepare for the temple. So phase 3 is 1842 and 43. The men are endowed first, and then the women are endowed in 1843, which brings up an interesting point in another one of my papers, which is that the temple endowment, it was about inducting men and women into the high priesthood of the ancient temple. So that unlike the Old Testament, where you only had the high priest who could go into the temple and the Holy of Holies and be an intercessor on behalf of the people to go in and commune with the Lord, that was the role of the high priest anciently. Well, in the restoration of, the LDS restoration, Joseph was inspired to induct men and women. Joseph Smith was inspired to induct men and women, everyone, into the high priesthood of the temple, where they could all go in and function as high priests and priestesses of the holy temple and commune with the Lord as the ancient high priests used to. And so phase 3, all I really need to say about that is that they've been prepared by the male orders of Melchizedek and Aaronic, and they've been prepared by the Relief Society and the Young Ladies Relief Society. And so the endowment gives men and women in 1842 and 43 the fullness of priesthood. It was designed to convey the fullness of priesthood and all the keys of priesthood onto each man and woman individually. It was not a sealing ceremony. It had nothing to do with sealing or marriage. There were men and women who received the fullness of the temple endowment without a partner. And their partner may receive it later the next year, or Lucy Mack Smith was there without a partner. It was not about marriage, and it was not based on marriage. It was individual reception, conferral of the fullness of the priesthood with all the keys. It's the high priesthood. And so it goes beyond the preparatory priesthoods of Melchizedek and Relief Society to convey the fullness of priesthood and all the keys onto each individual. That's what the endowment was, and that's what it did. And later it got changed also. And what they were told, just like in 1830, in Section 25, the Emma was ordained, and just like in 1842, the Relief Society leaders were ordained, in the temple, the women were anointed and ordained a queen and priestess to the Most High God. And that's the version of the ceremony that we get from Joseph's journal and from Eliza R. Snow and other sources that are hearkening to that original thing. And so it's
which is different than what we have experienced as women in this day. That those are different words.
Yeah, they're different.
We now experience.
They're different words because originally they were anointed and ordained, a priestess to the Most High God.
The Most High God.
And directly to God. They were not ordained a priestess to their husband. That language came in when Brigham Young rewrote the temple ceremony in 1845 and 46 after Joseph died. And then his wife and Heber C. Kimball's wife, they were ordained queen and priestess to their husbands. And that's where that language came in. And that's in my paper. My paper talks all about this and cites all the sources. So what I want to say in finality about all that is that women were ordained at all three levels in parallel to men, but to female offices and female orders, not to male orders and offices. That's why people think they weren't ordained a priest, because it was female offices and female orders. And those are three levels of ministry and authority and priesthood. The lay Christian ministry, which restores the New Testament Christian community. Then the Old Testament, going back and grabbing the Old Testament priesthood, the gendered orders, male and female orders, which was really important to go back and bring that together as well. And then the third stage or level, which is the high priesthood, to be able to enter the temple and function as a high priest or priestess. And that's the fullness of priesthood. And so it wasn't till you got the endowment that you got the fullness. The other two stages were preparatory of lay Christian ministry and preparatory priesthoods. But the temple conveyed the fullness of priesthood and its keys. And so it's brilliant. It's inspired. Men and women received parallel authority every step of the way in those three stages. That's what my work reveals and has revealed since the 1980s. And I see it all coming back, and it doesn't just come from me. It's everybody working together to recover what we had forgotten and what we had lost.
Yeah, it's both inspiring and sometimes a little bit, discouraging because of what you feel like, again, the potential is, what perhaps the intention was, and then what was lost in that. And so I know that we have had this deep discussion. I've had lots of questions because I want anyone who's listening who may be also wanting to make sure that we're really understanding or that may have some of the similar questions that they can hear those perspectives as well and clarification. But I want to ask maybe one general closing question, which would be, what would be then, having looked and sifted through all of this history and seeing all of this, what then would be your hope for the continued restoration for women in the future?
Beautiful question. And I'm really glad you asked it, because there's a lot of frustration along with hope. Because of what we lost that parallel equality and the self-governing authority of the women and their keys and priesthood. We lost a lot of that. We didn't lose all of it, though. A lot of it was still there the whole time. But by losing that, women, their authority became subverted under male authority. And that's been extremely harmful to women for decades. And so there's a lot of pain and a lot of loss and a lot of disempowerment that women have suffered in ways that I don't think men even comprehend. And so the feminist critiques and the feminist work, including mine and so many others that came forth in the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s, was vital. Exponent 2 and the book Mormon Sisters, which we just celebrated at a conference 2 weeks ago, and the Dialogue Pink issue, and papers by Lyndon Newell that came forward, and Margaret Toscano and others, and then my work. We were all recovering this female authority and equality that had been forgotten. And it was really, really important. But there's so much pain there and a lot of anger, and so it was really important for the Mormon Women's Forum to come forward and reclaim it, and the Exponent retreats and the pilgrimage retreats, and for feminist Mormon housewives to come forward and try to reclaim some of this, and ordained women who brought back the O word, ordain. We hadn't really brought that back. That was their task, to recover the O word. Because in our work in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about priesthood. We recovered the P word and the F word, feminism, that we had our own homegrown feminism, right? And that it wasn't some secular thing that came from outside the church. Feminism was there from the beginning with Emma and her role. And so we recovered our own homegrown Mormon feminism from our origins, and we recovered women's relationship to priesthood. But we also had to recover the word ordain, which I really credit to Ordained Women and Kate Kelly for recovering that. But there are all these pieces that are recovered. And so it's all been coming back. And I'm very excited. I think it's the most exciting time in LDS history, because I think we're we're piecing together the fullness of the gospel and the fullness of the priesthood. And it takes all to restore the priesthood. It takes all. And so I see it coming back. It's been achingly slow. So many women have suffered and left. We have to acknowledge the loss and the pain that women were denied their equality and their priesthood for so long, but it's coming back. And so I'm very excited and very hopeful, and I have the patience of Job to work with all of this since the 1970s when I served as a missionary. I was recovering and really asserting my equality with the elders in the mission field as an ordained missionary. I saw myself as having some degree of priesthood, and I didn't even understand it then. And then when I went through the temple endowment, I knew I had received priesthood, but I didn't understand it. And so I had to go and do all this research in the 1980s and 90s to figure out what I had experienced spiritually in 1978 as a missionary when I was, set apart, but I was actually ordained. The term used in 1850 when Brigham Young ordained Louisa Barnes Pratt as a full-time missionary was ordained. She was ordained a full-time missionary to go to the Pacific Islands, and he gave her a vial of consecrated oil to use to give blessings and healings on her mission, which she did. So the word was ordained. And so I see it coming back. We're recovering it, and it's all of us together. It's you and your work and your podcast in her image. All of these things, all of this feminist effort, and all of the effort by women leaders in the church and women historians in the church and women at BYU. It takes all of us, and it's coming back. And I ache and I weep for the loss and the suffering that I've experienced and other women have experienced for decades because our equality and our priesthood was denied. And so we have to deal with both the pain and the loss and the mistakes and the harm to women, particularly the ways women were disempowered all those years under male authority. But at the same time, I hold on to the hope and what I'm seeing with all of these things that have happened in the last 10 to 15 years. And I was literally ecstatic when I heard President Johnson talk about the restoration of the ancient female orders. I'm very hopeful. I'm also very tired. I am very hopeful, and it's young feminists like you who keep me going, Jessica. You keep me going.
Thank you. Well, it's our foremothers like you who keep us going and who have had the time and the talents and the skills to dig so deeply. And I'm just so grateful for your willingness to share all of that and to share it here, to continue to give new ways of seeing things to those who listen and perhaps new hope, along with the healing of the recognition of the suffering as well.
Yeah, and I really want to say one last thing is don't fear each other. I see so much fear and condemnation of feminism and people condemning each other online, and that's just darkness. That's just dark. That's dark, destructive energy. There's a deeper truth with the Spirit of God that is working among all of us. And so when people go online and trash each other or trash feminists, or trash Kate Kelly, or trash Sherry Dew, or trash the Relief Society leaders. There are some disillusioned people who trash female leaders and male leaders of the church. I love them. I love those leaders. They're amazing. I don't always agree with them, but I honor them. I know how hard they work, and I honor our feminists and our scholars and historians who are excavating this information. And so I am deeply pained and very worried and frankly frustrated when I hear people online trashing each other, when I hear disillusioned people trashing Joseph Smith or trashing the church, and when I hear defenders of the faith trashing feminists or even Leonard Arrington. I've heard some apologists out there trashing Leonard Arrington of all people. So, that just needs to stop. And I am formally calling right now, honestly, all of those people online who are trashing each other from either side, stop. You are destroying the body of Christ. You are not ministering. You are not. You are destroying. And calling for people's excommunications and celebrating when somebody has to leave the church, that's evil. Just stop. We are all members of the
Yeah.
body of Christ, and the Doctrine and Covenants makes it very clear that when we have disagreements with each other, we need to counsel with each other and recognize that we are all parts of the body of Christ and not cast each other out. And that's my call
Yeah.
as a minister and a chaplain, and a feminist and a historian. That's my call.
I love that. I think that is so important to realize. It's like we can question and we can disagree.
Yep.
And we can take words and we can question and say, I don't agree with this part. And I think differently here. And here's a different perspective that we need to be looking at. But when you talk about that tearing down and those destructive energy that just creates more wounds that we have to get in the mess of healing before we can ever rise above.
Right.
And make the progress, because we cannot progress as a community when there are that many wounds that are needing to be healed first, that we're inflicting on each other.
Right. And you said it so well. It's so important to be able to disagree. Scholars disagree with each other. Historians disagree with each other. Church leaders and professors and disagree with each other. Feminists disagree with each other. Disagreement is vital in order to learn from each other and see what we're not seeing. Disagreement is vital, but we also have to be open and humble and remember we don't know everything. We know how much we know, but we don't know what other people know. And guess what? We might just learn something new from somebody who disagrees with us. So disagreement is sacred and dissent is sacred. It's a process of dialectic, which is the basis of Western civilization. If we can't disagree with each other and hear each other and actually respond to what each other is saying, we're going to lose civilization. Oh, that's what I'm seeing online and in politics and even invading the church. I'm seeing this horrible dark energy that just wants to destroy anybody who disagrees with you, anybody who sees things differently. Well, that's how we learn. It's there in the Doctrine and Covenants that we need all the gifts. We need all the different perspectives in order to have the full body of Christ. And so don't fear a different point of view or someone who disagrees with you. You don't have to agree with them. It's not incumbent upon you. Just listen and dialogue and learn together. Again, the Doctrine and Covenants makes it very clear. And it's one of my favorite parts of the Doctrine and Covenants that says that we are called to enlighten and teach, and I can't remember the word, but to instruct each other in the gospel. And so it takes all of us, and we just cannot condemn each other for seeing things differently or disagreeing. That's just dark energy.
Yeah. We can do it in a way that still maintains the respect for each other as members of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one more question that came up for me when you were answering the last one is, what counselor advice would you give to regular women who yearn for the greater restoration of equality and of their power within the institution of the church?
I would say, well, first off, I think every person needs to do what is healthy for them. If you are a gay person or a trans person and the church is harming you, then you might need to look for a different community that welcomes, gay and trans people, and if you're a feminist who's just exhausted, you might need to go find a spirituality group that feeds you, honor your journey, honor your path where God is teaching and leading you. Don't shut yourself down, honor your journey and your spiritual path, which is written in your soul. But also recognize that your individual path is different from the group, the church path. The church is on its own journey, its own path of spiritual formation and development. And so the individual path is often in a different place or stage or need than where the group is, where the ward is, where the whole church is. Those are two different paths, but they're both important, and neither one should shut down or eradicate the other. Individuals shouldn't be shunned or kicked out of the church for being in a different place than where the handbook and the lesson manuals are today, this month. Because guess what? The handbook, the lesson manuals, the website, the church official discourse is constantly evolving, right? And so we need to have grace for each other and hold space for each other, because the community, the group path together is really important. It's important to be part of the community, but not let it stifle or stop your own individual path. But also recognize that you cannot expect the ward members or the whole church to be where you are. And so honor your journey. Don't shut it down, but don't expect other people to be where you are. Don't judge them or condemn them for being in a different place, which I see, like I said, happening on all sides. So I would just encourage women to tune into their relationship with God. That's the basis of the restoration, is your divine connection to God. And that's what the fullness of the priesthood and the endowment was officially enacting as a ritual, that you were ordained a priestess to the Most High God. So tune into your relationship with God and stay close to God and listen and follow and find your path, find your purpose, what you're here to do, and try to stay in community as much as you can. And just know that other people's views and even their criticisms of you, you don't have to own those. It's not about you. That's who they are. Don't let other people shut you down or tell you who you need to be. And at the same time, don't fight or strike back at them. Just know that that's where they are. That's okay. You don't need to own it. And just be you and be who you are inspired to be, and contribute your spirituality and your vision and your positive experiences to the ward and to the members as much as you can, and fulfill your callings and be a minister. Every member is a minister. When you are confirmed a member, you are confirmed a disciple and a witness of Jesus Christ. And be a minister, which means hold safe space for others to process what they're going through. Because as you hold safe space for others, that's true ministering. And guess what? They're going to open up and feel free and safe with you to explore what they're struggling with. And they're going to be less inclined to criticize you when you are holding safe space for others, for their journey, and recognizing that that's their path, that's their struggle, that's their belief, and it doesn't define yours. Then you can hold safe space for them and to be themselves. And that enables you to also do the same. And that way we aren't shutting each other down. We are truly ministering to each other because we are holding safe space for each other. We're doing what the Book of Mormon tells us to do, And so that way you are honoring your own role as a minister, but you're honoring the other person's path where they are. And you don't have the answers for them. You're not imposing your answers or your views or your beliefs or your stage onto them. You don't have their answers. You are holding a safe space for them to find their own, and that's ministry. And then look for people who will do the same for you. Don't go to somebody who's going to condemn you or shut you down because of what you're struggling with or the stage of faith or faith crisis that you might be in. Look for people who truly practice ministry, who will hold a safe space for you as you work through everything that you're experiencing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I have appreciated so much the historical insights that you gave, as well as the spiritual and personal insights. And I feel like that ending was just so perfect. What a wonderful wrap up to bring it back to, as you said, that personal relationship with God, our personal revelation, which is where we began with this whole conversation and with our series, right? The importance of recognizing our personal connections to the divine, and to trusting in that, and recognizing that people's paths may be different, that there may be times when, because of harm that is being done or exhaustion, you may need to find other types of community.
Yeah.
You may need to take breaks. You may need to, and trusting your path and trusting that others can follow their paths. And that when we are engaging in that community, as we are, if we and as we choose to continue to participate in our church community, that we can still be just respectful voices of truth in what ways we can, and be ministers and hold space for ourselves, our own authority, and for the journeys of others. So that was just so beautifully said, and I appreciate that so much. And we love having you on here. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Maxine, and for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Jessica. I love your podcast. It's just so it's so sincere, and your podcast, In Her Image, it really allows women to delve into their own direct connection to the divine. I love that. And I just want to say, you can do both. You can be active in your ward, be a minister to others in your ward, and you can still participate in other groups, spirituality groups, or even attend other churches. You can do both, and so just honor yourself. But yeah, I love this podcast, and I love the space, the safe space that your podcast creates for women to explore their spirituality and their direct spiritual connection to God, both the Father and the Mother.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Maxine.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, we invite you to come on over to patreon.com/inherimagepodcast for more content and community. You will have opportunities to participate in Q&A sessions, quarterly book clubs, access to a Marco Polo or Facebook group chat with our hosts, and the insider scoop on events, meetups, and retreats. We're so excited to meet you. And of course, tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.